So when we look at futures and forward contracts, we have to start thinking about, well, what are the variables? What are the key variables? And do these contracts actually conform to our recognition criterion, the 3 recognition criterion? So let's start thinking about what we should see in, let's use the forward contract as the basis of our discussion. So let's, because you would theoretically see similar types of variables in a futures contract. So let's look at a forward contract. And let's think about what the variables are going to be. Well, we're going to have the counterparties. Who is buying and who's selling. So we need to know that. We need to understand what is the asset or liability. That is part of the, what is it that we're trading? What is it that we're going to execute sometime in the future? So what is the asset, liability, the commodity, the currency, whatever is part, what is the basis of the contract? Okay? We have to know what that is. Okay? We need to know what is the inception date of the contract. When did we agree to do this? When does it start? Right? When does it become active? We need to know what is the maturity date, or the actual transaction date. And what we mean by the transaction date, that's when we're actually going to exchange cash for whatever. Or maybe this forward contract is we're going to exchange one asset for another asset. That could be cash, it could be something else, right? So what is the transaction date? Sometime likely in the future from the inception date. We're going to have to determine what is the price, selling price or purchase price. Selling price or the purchase price, whatever that is. And these are things that should be articulated in the contract. Other things that you might see is if there is a requirement for a margin call. Okay. Other things around termination, what you would normally see in a particular contract, right? So these are going to be your basic blocking and tackling items that you'll see in a simple, again, we're trying to keep this simple, a simple forward contract. So let's think about, does this forward contract conform to our 3 criteria, right? So we want to make sure that we're at least conforming to the 3 criterion as we establish those 3 criterion. And if you recall the 3 criterion, we've got to make sure that we have an underlying and a notional amount, or a payment provision if there's not a notional amount, little or no initial investment, and net settlement, or the implicit ability to settle net in cash. So just remember, just kind of reminding us what that is. So what do we got here? The first thing we've got to do is we've got to figure out, well, what is the underlying? Well, we have to go back to looking at what is the asset, liability, commodity, and currency, right? And if these things move as far as price is concerned, whatever is this particular item, the price, the market price, of this asset, liability, commodity, currency, that is your underlying. Okay? So we've identified the asset, liability, commodity. The other thing we have to identify in the contract is the amount of the asset liability, commodity, or currency. This, as you might imagine, is the notional amount. So whatever the market price is of our asset, liability, commodity, currency, that is your underlying, the amount of the asset, liability, commodity, and currency, that's going to be your notional amount. Okay? That's going to be your notional amount. Little or no initial net investment. Well, it's likely that I'm not going to have to spend a lot of money. We've probably agreed upon a price sometime in the future that everyone believes in, and it's likely going to be a smaller amount, or the amount of money that we have to change hands right now to do this trade is going to be significantly smaller than if I had to buy the asset, sell the liability, buy the liability, commodity, currency, if I had to do it right now. So in this forward contract, it's likely that we're not spending a lot of money to engage in this particular contract. And then the last thing is, can we settle net? Well, if we're dealing with an exchange-traded asset, if we're dealing with an exchange-traded commodity, a currency, then there is an ability or a theory that we could hand over this particular contract and just take what, before we get to the maturity date. And we could, instead of taking possession, we could theoretically sell this contract and take back whatever the net cash amount is without actually having to take possession of the asset. So whether I do it early or whether I do it on the maturity date, there is an ability, or there's a theory that either I can, or contractually in the contract, there is the ability to settle net in the contract. So if you're not dealing with an exchange-traded asset, then you'd be looking for, in the contract, for it to be able to be settled net in cash. So this forward contract does qualify as a derivative. Unsurprisingly, a futures contract has a lot of these same types of attributes that would also be able to be considered a derivative and qualify under the 3 criterion.